Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the RCV Roundtable podcast with Austin.
And Nikita, thank you guys so much for the love and support that you showed on our last episode. Really hope you guys enjoyed it and our little game of myth or fact and learned something new from it as well.
Yeah, in the next few episodes, we'll be focusing on specific states and the ranked choice voting journey. And for today's episode, we're going to do a very big deep dive into the RCV movement in Maine to help understand the struggles, challenges, and successes of that organization in that state and see how their platform and how they went about it could influence other states that want to also introduce and implement ranked choice voting.
Exactly. So we are going all the way back to March 2001, before Austin and I were even born, when ranked choice voting was first introduced in Maine state legislature. This was aimed to address concerns about the spoiler effect, which is when votes in a majority block are splintered because there are several candidates that have similar views, which helps the minority block win, as well as the winner take all system where candidates could win elections with less than a majority of the vote.
Yeah, and so those efforts were not fruitful, but later on, Diane Russell, who we're going to have on later as a guest, she in June of 2009, the Maine legislature unfortunately killed her bill that she was sponsoring, that which would have established ranked choice voting, pilot projects in several Maine municipalities, Portland being the biggest. However, that did not stop the movement.
In October 2015, Diane launched the petition drive to put a citizen initiative question on the ballot for ranked choice voting, which eventually formed the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting. And in 2016, Maine became the first state in the United States that passed a citizen-led initiative for ranked choice voting. 52% of Maine voters approved the implementation of ranked choice voting for gubernatorial and legislative races.
However, after getting that approved, the Maine legislature saw that there were a little bit of questions and areas that it could be unconstitutional. And so in October of 2017, ranked choice voting was put into jeopardy as the Maine legislature enacted a bill to stop the implementation of ranked choice voting until 2021. And they said that they needed to postpone the implementation because the Maine Constitution didn't really allow it for the gubernatorial and state house races. So they included a provision in that bill in 2017 to nullify ranked choice voting if the Constitution wasn't amended before December of 2021.
And in November 2017, after a lot of advocacy and grassroots organizing, the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting launched a people's veto campaign to repeal that bill, putting off the implementation of ranked choice voting. And finally, in 2018, the people's veto was certified by the Secretary of State with a 54% majority that amended or tried to amend, and we'll get more into this later, Maine's constitution to establish ranked choice voting for primary and general elections for state offices, including federal congressional offices. Maine was the first state in the country to use ranked choice voting in federal elections.
Yeah, so Maine has been using ranked choice voting in their federal elections since 2018. Used it in the presidential race in 2020 and congressional house races in 2022, but they still lack ranked choice voting in their governor and other state house races and other statewide offices as well. So overall, clearly there has been a very tumultuous history in Maine about having to get ranked choice voting implemented, and obviously there's clearly work that needs to be done as well.
So, to discuss this further, we have a very, very special guest here with us today. We can even say that she is the mother of ranked choice voting in Maine, Miss Diane Russell. She is a former Democratic member of the House of the Maine House of Representatives, representing District 39 from 2008 to 2016. She was also a candidate for governor in Maine for the 2018 election, and she is a key leader in reforming Maine's political system as a longtime champion of ranked choice voting since 2007.
From sponsoring legislation to being a part of a core team on the Original Citizens Initiative to quarterbacking the people's veto signature drive to being plaintiffs in lawsuits to defend ranked choice voting. Diane has been there every step of the way for fighting for the voting rights of people and to have more choice and more voice in their democracy. We're so honored to have you here today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you guys because there's never a moment that we should be talking about ranked choice voting and how we shore up our democracy across the country.
Yes, totally agree. So just to get to know your history of ranked choice voting, like what were some like key factors that really like motivated you to even like look up what ranked choice voting is, learn what it is, and then turn it into this movement in Maine?
Yeah, so I had wanted to vote for a Green Party candidate, and there was a gentleman who was running for governor who happened to not believe that women should have the right to make their own reproductive health decisions. And so I really was faced with this choice of, the Democrat who I liked, the Republican who is charming and lovely in person, but not someone I want in the position of governor. And then we had this Green Party candidate, Pat LaMarche, who was just talking about all the issues that we care about, student debt, climate change, workers' rights, all of these things that I care deeply about. And so I wanted to be able to vote for her, but I didn't feel comfortable voting for her with the chance that we might have someone who would take away my rights and other people's rights. So I literally said to myself, there's got to be a better way. And so these are the early days of the Google, but I did a Google search for voting systems, and what came up with it was instant runoff voting, which is the other terminology, the older terminology for RCV. And fundamentally, it was about having choice. Like I had the choice. I didn't have the right to exercise that choice. Right. And I felt disenfranchised in that moment because I didn't get the right to vote for the candidate that really, warmed my heart. And later on, many years later, I'm very, very good friends with that candidate. Right. And then I ended up running. So I just felt like we needed greater choice, but we needed the right to have those choices, right? Just because you can go to the ice cream store doesn't mean that you can't get the second choice. Well, you can if you go to the ice cream store. You just can't do it when you go to the voting booth. And I just felt like that needed to change. And so while I was down there, my home seat opened up, and I hadn't changed my residency. I was just working down there for a year or so. And so I ran for office. And I had already been working with lawmakers up in Maine, like Seth Berry, to be pushing this. So I'm not the first, but I brought a different vision to the table, right? I understood, I grew up, when I was young, I was in public relations right out of the gate. And so I understood how to craft a narrative and stick to that narrative and really make the compelling case that needed to be made. And so we started, I brought in legislation, and the committee was like, wow, we don't have any local stuff that's, pertinent here. So I went back to Portland, and some folks, we've been working on moving a charter commission forward. So we got ranked choice voting passed in Portland, and we had a very successful pilot project. So I brought back the pilot project, and they were like, well, we just don't really like the timing, And I was like, well, what do you mean? I gave you what you wanted. So the goalposts constantly change, because what we're talking about here is not just about your voting rights, right? Voting is a euphemism for power. Voting is how we express our power. And the more limits on voting that you have, the more limits on your power. And so I kept bringing this forward. Dick Woodbury was a state senator, an independent. He brought a version forward. And then Dick approached me one day, and I already had a referendum on the docket coming up, and that would be cannabis reform. And I knew that was coming up in the next year. And I also know how hard citizens initiatives are. And so Dick approaches me about a citizens initiative, and I was like, I already have one planned. You want me to do two? What? so we had a week to do the actual planning, because in Maine you can collect signatures at the polls. That's not true in every state. And that's where you get the bulk of your signatures. So I was literally working from 6 a.m. to like 2 a.m.
Oh my
And
goodness.
oh yeah, for a week, because nobody knew how to organize for election day. I was the only one that had done that. And, Dick brought Kara McCormick into the mix, and the three of us spent a week just doing nothing
Wow.
but recruiting people, slotting them, and getting them trained up and getting petitions out. And we collected over 40,000 signatures on election day, and we needed about 70,000 total to get on the ballot. It was like 62 valid, but you need a cushion. You said earlier, you talked about the sheer number of lawsuits we had to go through, right? So we finally bring this to ballot. We go through the process, we get our signatures, we turn them in, people vote for it. And there were 5 referenda that in the course of 2 years. And of the 5, 4 of them were repealed, and marijuana or in some form, and the marijuana policy was delayed by many, many years. So that's my big broad overview. Sorry, I just kept going. Sorry.
No, you're excited, and there's so much. This is exactly why, a big part of what we want to do is bring on experts, because like I have learned so much in this conversation than I could have done in all of my research on Google. So yeah, no, you brought up very, very interesting things that like kind of in a sense that like everything is connected in terms of power and that restructuring that power. So I guess, we discussed a little bit about the different lawsuits and challenges that you faced while advocating for the adoption of ranked choice voting. What were some of these challenges? How were you and are still trying to overcome these challenges? And what are the challenges that still persist?
So that's a really good set of questions. So let's just unpack the lawsuits for a second. So they repealed ranked choice voting.
Mhm.
And so we are in October, and I'm like 2.5 months into a governor's race, and I know that I'm the one that knows how to quarterback a 90-day turnaround. So with a referendum, you have a year to collect the signatures. For people's veto, you have 90 days. And this was the first time, and frankly, I think it's still the only time, when a referendum was used to protect a referendum. So we passed ranked choice voting by referendum, and then we used the people's veto, which is a referendum process, to block the repeal. So that's very important to understand. So we were doing a people's veto to block their repeal. There were some constitutional questions that came up, and they didn't just come up; they were actively asked as a means to sink the program, around the whether or not it is constitutional under Maine state constitutional law. I believe that it is, and it has not officially been litigated. What happened is they did a solemn occasion and requested an advisory opinion from the state Supreme Court, the law court. And they came back and they said, well, we would probably find this piece unconstitutional. That specifically relates to the House and the Senate and the governor's race in the general election, the fall election. So we did not repeal that piece. We figured we'd live to fight another day on that. And we have not been able to get that over the finish line. And the irony is that the reason people wanted this is they wanted to be able to have multiple choices for governor in the fall, the general election. And they don't. The whole reason we did this is not yet implemented, and that's one of the challenges. But you can do it for the president of the United States, just not governor, because apparently we're stupid. But by my reading of the Constitution, I think it comes down to the definition of majority. We challenged with the people's veto, and then we were really smart. We asked if we could. I was at a conference actually when all of this started, when all of the decisions were happening, but I was like, can we submit the paperwork to the Secretary of State before the everything comes to fruition and through the timeline? And I was like, I've never asked this question, so I don't know. And so we asked, and they were like, yeah, you can do this. So even though it hadn't gotten all the way through the legislative process, the bill, we filed early. And then we announced to the media very politely that we'd filed early and that we were just waiting for the Secretary of State's office to send us our petitions. Now, the Secretary of State's office at the time had been absolutely against RCV, as had the current governor, who was Attorney General at the time. And so all of this was a little in a gray area because nobody had really done a people's veto to block of a referendum before. And we had a governor's race to run, and we knew that people wanted to be able to use it for the governor's primary. And so all of this is happening, and we managed, so by dropping it to the media that we had submitted it and we were just waiting for the Secretary of State's office, of course all the news explodes, just waiting on the Secretary of State's office. And then there was a little microphone up to the Secretary of State 5 times a day. Are you going to get the petitions to them on time? Are you going to get the petitions to them on time? So the timeline that they have up to 10 days to send us the petition, right? And so we had a very tight timeline because this was October and the election was in November, and we needed to be able to collect signatures on election day. So we were very smart about how we handled it, because we didn't say we don't believe the Secretary of State's going to get it to us. We just said we hope the Secretary of State gets it to us. So we got our petitions at 3:30 the day before the election day, and we had to go get them all printed all over. We printed them all over Staples all across the state and had people pick them up from where they were. And then, so we finally get it on the ballot again. And mind you, I'm running for governor this whole time. Not well, apparently, because I had a concussion in the middle of it, which is super fun. But oh yeah, I fell on the ice.
Oh my goodness.
But I had to keep going. And so then everybody was like, well, what are we going to do? Because the Secretary of State came out after we turned in the petitions and said, well, we don't have to implement because the law doesn't get blocked until the petitions are certified. And I said, nope, that was a quote in the media. And I said, no, that's not true. You look at the Constitution, and he just assumed that everybody was going to believe him. And he's a good guy, don't get me wrong. We just happen to disagree on this point. So I looked at the Constitution and I said, no, actually the law gets blocked the moment we turn in the petitions. And so our team was like, well, what do we do? I said, well, we're going to have to sue to force the Secretary of State to run a ranked choice voting program during the primary. So we were going to both have a gubernatorial primary, and there were 7 of us candidates running, right? At the same time, we were going to be voting on whether or not you liked ranked choice voting. So as you're voting on whether or not you're liking ranked choice voting, you're literally going through the primary and filling out your ranked choice voting ballot, all in a June primary, right? And nobody shows up for the primary. We had a higher percentage of voters voting with us the second time than we did the first. We heard so many people. So remember I told you that they had repealed or screwed up like 4 out of 5 referenda. So all these issues that people had voted on that had been stolen from them, right? They put it all on us. And they were like, your referendum it represents all of these other ones that politicians have overturned. People were absolutely furious. We passed it at the ballot box. We made a decision. This wasn't a poll. This was an actual electoral vote. And then you turned around and you repealed it. And of course, we did somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 town halls for the governor's race. So what am I doing every single packed town hall? I'm talking holding up the petitions, or I'm talking about what the damn leaders did to rank choice voting and ginning everybody up. And all anybody wanted to talk about is, why did ranked choice voting get repealed? Why did all these other things get repealed? Why aren't you paying attention to the voters? So it's really funny how we flipped the script on them. They didn't think that we would actually take the bait and do the people's veto. So the first time we sued, it was to force them to actually do ranked choice voting. And remember I told you that solemn occasion that they had requested from the law court? Well, that was before all of these lawsuits, and the law court didn't understand ranked choice voting. It understands it quite well now because it has gone through the law court multiple times. We got all of this momentum built, and the backlash, like, politicians in Maine have not just learned not to mess with ranked choice voting, they've also learned not to mess with the ballot box, because I literally rubbed their noses in it throughout my time running for governor, and talked to people over and over again about what certain leaders were doing, and that they were really turning their nose up at everyday people. So I think the real key here is people, you have to understand that when we first started bringing this up, people laughed at me, right? They thought it was cute and funny. No one understands this. No one understands this. No one's going to want this. This is just too complicated. People can't understand it. And then we went out and we knocked on people's doors and we explained it to them, and they were like, oh God, that makes sense. You mean I can vote? I can rank. Wait, what? That's a possibility. So we had to educate people on a very profound level of what it meant for them, not just how it worked, because that's a harder conversation, but really what the outcomes and the benefits are. And we built a coalition, a cross-partisan coalition. And what did we see when Maine got it passed? Right? We saw a movement in Massachusetts that, because of COVID, couldn't get over the finish line, but sparked more movements. We're seeing community after community, state by state, start bringing it up. Alaska, we now have 2 members of Congress who are sitting members of Congress who would not be in Congress had people not had this right to vote the way to candidates, right? So it's about diffusing power, and and when you diffuse power, you also, that's DIFFUSE, but you also defuse, DEFUSE, extremism. And lastly, I would say that, this ultimately went all the way to the US Supreme Court. The RNC, the Republican National Committee, literally spent millions of dollars taking this all the way to the US Supreme Court, to their US Supreme Court, where they refused to take it up. And so we won. And they kept saying over and over again, well, this is not one person, one vote. Actually, it is. And if it's not, then all of Georgia's elections and Louisiana's runoff elections are not actually one person, one vote either. Because if runoffs are legitimate, ranked choice voting is legitimate. So we have, I thank them too for taking it all the way to the US Supreme Court, because knowing that it was a very conservative Supreme Court means that they're not going to be able to do that again in the future. It stands on its own merits. So we took a big idea that no one knew what to do with. We gave them a solution, but still, a solution's one thing, but someone else is going to do it, right? Don't we always look to the type A personality that they're going to fix it? Well, I hate to tell you, I'm not the gal that's going to fix all your problems. Like, the reason we fix these things is because we did it together. And that's because, number 3, we gave people a concrete action that was measurable, that was definable and digestible, that they could do. They could take a day off of work, or they could go in after work or before work and collect signatures and turn them in. That was a concrete ask. And when you take big problems, match them with a big solution, and a small way to interact with that big solution, where truly the hands of many make light work, that is when real change happens. But ranked choice voting, now that we've got the news all across the country about it, and there's movements building, Rank the Vote has chapters in so many places, and just get on those Zoom calls and learn what other states are doing, learn what other towns are doing. And if you don't think you could bring this to your state, that's fine. Bring it to your town. When your town or your city has a new charter commission that comes out, run for charter commission and advocate that that ranked choice voting be part of the conversation. That's how we got ranked choice voting moving in Portland. We got people on the charter commission.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you a question about how Maine is currently trying to get its governor to be elected through ranked choice voting. Maine has had a strong support for independent candidates in the past, and this is much of the reason why Maine has shifted towards ranked choice voting. I mean, one of their senators, Angus King, is a current independent that caucuses with the Democrats, as well as numerous other gubernatorial independent candidates have gotten good percentages of the votes in the past, but still, ranked choice voting is only used in congressional and presidential races in Maine. So can you please talk to us about how getting the Maine Constitution amended in the state house right now and subsequent initiative, how is that process playing out? Are you involved in that process? Yeah, can you give us quick updates about how getting governor and state house ranked choice voting is working?
Yeah, so we can vote in the primaries for state house and governor, but we have a constitutional question as to whether, so Maine requires a majority vote in the state constitution, but you can get to a majority vote. It doesn't specify how, and so that's the question I was bringing up earlier around the solemn occasion. And I believe that if the law court were to look at it now, that they might actually have a different view on it. And they specifically said in the advisory opinion that this is just an advisory opinion, and that if this were actually litigated, we might come to a different conclusion. There was no evidence. There was no real, I mean, we could file a brief in response, but there wasn't, it was very much a one-sided affair. And it came to an unfortunate outcome. We're kind of at a standstill, to be honest, because if you were to put it on the ballot, it would still be a issue of constitutional. So the question is whether you'd win on that if people weren't sure if it was constitutional. I think that at this point, people would probably vote for it. So I think the lawmakers are never gonna pass a constitutional amendment because there's enough of them that don't want this, that they'll be able to block it because it requires a 2/3 vote in the House, the Senate, and then a majority vote by the people of the state at the ballot box. So that's how we get a constitutional amendment changed. So this advisory opinion has created a stalemate but it's in favor of people that don't want it changed, right? Because now the people who want it for governor and state house in the fall can't get it because the people who are in the state house refuse to do what they're supposed to do. So I think the only path forward would be to bring a new referendum openly and unapologetically challenging the constitutional question, meaning once it gets passed, then you would have standing to litigate and force it. Right now, there's not even a posture because that section has been effectively repealed because we didn't block that section of the repeal. There's nothing on the books that even creates standing for someone to be able to sue in the current posture. So there's no way to get it in front of the courts on that particular issue without a new referendum or without passing it straight up in the legislature. Now I know there are legislators who are tracking ranked choice voting pretty closely and are pushing for it. I would just advocate for places that are looking at it in the future to not back down from the constitutional question and to fight it right from the get-go and nip it in the bud, because it really has forced us into a posture where we have it for almost everything, but we don't have it for the one type of election that we want it for.
Yeah. So yeah, just to follow up. So I know the Maine Legislature Legal Affairs Committee approved a proposal to change it to potentially have an amendment go through the legislature. And so do you have updates on that proposal, or like is it most likely not gonna even pass because of the lack of the 2/3 majority?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at that bill, but I'm guessing that it's not going to have the amount of votes that it needs to pass. I think the Democrats could pass it outright, and I think there are Republicans that support it. I know there's at least one. So I think that you could pass it outright and get it and then force the governor's hand on it. She keeps saying she supports ranked choice voting, but I haven't really seen much of that in practice, and neither have most of us in that realm. But you could force her hand, and she could very well come back in her veto message and say, well, it's not constitutional, per the advisory opinion, at which point you'd still need a 2/3 vote in order to override the veto. So it's possible that it could move forward. I think that the posture it's in right now, it's going to be very difficult to get that over the finish line.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride to say the least. But kind of pivoting a little bit, in your opinion, what do you think the impact of ranked choice voting has had on voter engagement and participation in Maine? Is there like an observed and noticeable change in voting behavior, or candidate strategies?
So I think it's hard to quantify the voter behavior other than I forget what the percentage is, but a fairly large number of percentage of voters are actually using it. So if they're using it, that to me says they're engaged in it. But as it relates to candidates, absolutely the picture has changed dramatically. You can't have these cutesy little spars. You can in the general election for governor, but you can't across the board, right? You can't in the primaries, and you can't for the federal elections. You can't just be like, oh, I know some really deep gossip about you, and I don't really care if I'm stretching the truth. I'm just going to tell everybody, and they're going to believe it, right? And you can't do that now because there's a third candidate in the race, and that if you pick, if I attack someone for their views, those voters are not going to come to me to be their second place vote. They're going to go to the third party person, right? And you can't have that. You need to appeal to your primary opponent's voters. And I don't mean primaries and primary election. I mean your top opponent, because usually there still are going to be two power players and one that's not really got the traction, right? What you don't want is for all your potential secondary votes to go to that third party, or to someone else. So you actually have to engage and say, you know what, you and I disagree on this point, but and we have but we have other things that are in common. And I hope your candidate, your supporters can see that there are places that we agree, and to be able to focus on some of those areas. And you can't just snap at someone and be all like, you just can't do that anymore. Not in a ranked choice voting election. And I will tell you that the candidate debates are level up. You have to actually debate the issues. I know this is a shocking thing to say out loud, but in a democracy, that your top priority should be debating the issues. This is something that shouldn't have to be said, and yet it has to be said. You have to debate the issues. And because nobody wants to deal with the drama. They don't want the culture war. They want to know how you're going to debate the issues. And if you're denigrating an individual or their candidates, the candidates' volunteers and supporters, or you're denigrating someone's neighbor, they don't have to vote for you. There's another option, right? And so that's why it doesn't eliminate, but it reduces the extremism, because I think you're seeing a lot of extremism because you do have gerrymandering, and you have like 30 districts in the House that might flip one way or the other. Every other district is solidly blue or red. Nothing should be solidly blue, and nothing should be solidly red. Everything should be purple.
Yeah, I totally agree. And especially when I'm on and canvassing out in the field, in Arizona, most polling shows that most Arizonans agree on what to do for water, for agriculture, for climate change, for reproductive rights. That's a big one. There's a lot of consensus, and that doesn't get reflected in our actual legislature, and all we see are these very archaic, very crazy just like laws that they're passing that like I don't like they were trying to ban like drag queen brunches. Like that is not what I am concerned about as a 19-year-old living in Arizona. That is not my top concern at all. But
And who doesn't have the best mimosas but drag queen brunch? That's where the best mimosas are.
so true. But I don't know yet.
We're not problem. Drag queens are the entertainment from our problems.
Yes. But yeah, I just wanted to share quick facts about Maine. I mean, over 90% of Mainers in their primary back in 2018 in the first use of ranked choice voting, over 90% said that they felt good about it and that they would want to use it again in the general elections in 2018. Over 61% that they'd continue to support it and want to expand it as well in Maine. But yeah, Maine is like a perfect example, not the prettiest, but just really show how electoral reform gets brought up through the states. And as someone that's working as a regional grassroots organizer in Arizona, I work specifically under Voter Choice Arizona. I was just very curious on like what advice, like what strategies or approaches would you recommend with like getting ranked choice voting passed in other states?
So the big advice is to focus on the benefits and not so much the process. And we have vote counting machines for a reason, and they can be designed to accommodate ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
But then you need to do the pivot, right? You need to pivot back to the benefits. It's like any sales thing, because you are selling an idea and it's important, but you also need to hear their concerns, right? You need to actually actively listen. This isn't just about a candidate and it's one or the other. This is a more complicated conversation with people, and it's okay to actually take the time and hear them, because and hear them actively, because sometimes we make assumptions about what people's concerns are based on what they've, a couple of words of what they've said. Let them get a whole sentence out. And it's really important with RCV, because a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding. You'll hear people talk about, well, I don't believe in weighted voting. Well, that's a different kind of voting system. Oh, and so hear the concerns that people have so that you can actually address those concerns, because if people can see as established fact that what they were thinking something is actually not what it is, and if you can agree on established facts, then they're like, and 9 times out of 10 they thought it was weighted voting, or they thought it was that they were voting twice, and that they were like, they didn't want to give up their first choice for their second choice candidate. There's a lot of misunderstandings. So if you actually take that extra 30 seconds to truly hear what someone's concerns are, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to walk them through how that's actually not, that's their interpretation of it. That's not actually how it works in practice. And in those instances, once you get to that part and you've addressed that, and usually it's just one piece of the puzzle that they've misunderstood. Once you clarify that, and you let them know, look, I'm not trying to challenge you. I just want to clarify so that you can make the best decision. And when you take that approach, you empower people to make their own decisions, and you don't threaten their own agency. Like, I respect whatever decision you make. I just want to make sure that you're clear about how the process works so that you can make the best decision for you. And sure, you can lean into and then you can lean back into the important pieces, which is having more representation, having people actually debate the issues as opposed to what they wore last Friday, right? That it's not a social media war, because that's not what people want. People actually want to come out and turn out and hear what people have to say, and they want to know that they're voting for a candidate that represents their values.
Yeah, that's a lot of good
Yeah.
advice, and definitely like I've already taken up on some of that. I make sure when I'm talking to people on the street, on a trailhead, or before they go into a movie, I make sure not to get bogged down into the details of ranked choice voting, because that definitely is confusing and will alienate people. I definitely center the message of like, it's no longer the lesser of two evils anymore. You can like actually vote your conscience. But yeah, this movement is definitely growing. I mean, Nevada will be voting on it again in 2024 as they pass it in 2022. Their state requires that they have to pass things sequentially in 2 elections. And then
Right.
Oregon will also be voting in 2024. So, and there could be other states to come as well. We might see next year, but yeah, overall, thank you, Maine. Maine is the pioneer in this. So
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah, no,
actually, our motto is Dirigo, and Dirigo is Latin for I lead.
Oh my God,
Wow.
that's perfect.
I like Dirigamos, we lead.
Oh,
Mm.
But our state motto is I lead and Dirigo, and we are literally one of the first pioneer states. We were one of the first places that got settled. And that spirit still lives on in our states. And one thing to keep in mind, and what as you're watching Arizona also tried to limit the ballot box
yeah.
privileges,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to be advocating for the right to petition our government in states that don't have that right. And we also have to be protecting the right to petition your government, and to because they'll do constitutional amendments and they'll make it sound like it's just it's for your benefit, but actually it's about taking your power away.
Yeah. In fact, we have we're gonna be voting on this next year because two parts of like stuff that we can vote on. One is like citizen initiated, like that comes from the citizens, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's legislative referred. So the legislature right now has been passing a lot of bills because they only need to get a majority to refer things back to the citizens, but they're passing a lot of potential referendums that could confuse voters. They like loaded up the ballot in 2022, and they're probably going to do it in 2024. For example, we're gonna be voting on whether or not referendums have to get at least like 10% of signatures from every legislative
Mm-hmm.
district. So it would make
That's the one.
that would make referendums like very, very hard, or in some cases like
Yeah.
impossible to like collect
Yeah.
signatures
Exactly.
for. So with the rise of more direct democracy and referendums, there's definitely a pushback to pass
Because it
things.
challenges power.
Yeah, challenges power. I mean, we're gonna see it in Ohio this coming next
Exactly.
month with the 60% constitutional amendment requirement that they'll be voting on next month, which could potentially hurt reproductive rights that are going to be at the
Oh
ballot
yeah.
box in November. So there's a lot of questions over how we
Power.
vote and how
Exactly.
direct democracy can operate in this country.
No, exactly like the power of direct democracy, especially in states such as Colorado, such as Maine, such as Arizona. We have seen you guys are pioneers or considered pioneers for a reason because the people are given that power directly. And that is unsurmountable um, advocacy that's given and an agency that's given. I really wanted to highlight the point about agency you brought on earlier because I think a lot of right now, at least, like we feel that our agency is taken away because decisions are made that are not favorable or liked by majority of the country. So giving that agency back to people and showing that within the process of how we teach people about ranked choice voting. It's the same with giving them the agency to decide, okay, do I like this? Do I not? But making sure that they have the facts to, make that educated decision for themselves. Because at the end of the day, that's your right to make your decision. And that's kind of what we're pushing for, for everyone to have the right to make their decision the way that they want to and not have that taken away from them. Wow, this has been one of the most productive conversations I have ever had about ranked choice voting. So thank you so,
Okay.
so much for taking the time to speak with us and giving us such valuable insights on like the ranked choice voting movement in Maine and just in general about like what it means for democracy, what it means for people, what it means um, for honestly the state of the world right now. Because I really love the analogy you made about like after a very dark period always comes a period of enlightenment, and this might be a dark period right now, but I'm a person who likes to look at optimism in that way while also being a realist. So the fact that, right now this might be a difficult time, there are people such as you, such as Austin, who are working tirelessly to, get people the rights that they are like they are your rights for a reason,
Valuable.
it's just exactly. So yeah, no, thank you so much for discussing all of this with us, and we really do hope that this information can be used for and useful for other organizers throughout the country who are trying to further ranked choice voting in their own states. For example, I live in Maryland, and I know we just got started our rank the vote chapter within Maryland, and that's starting to pick up quickly. So I mean, this movement is just growing so quickly day by day. Like it's insane the amount of like press and conversations that are happening around, and it's because of organizers, it's because of the grassroots movement. So I think all of this just kind of highlights exactly that we need people talking to people about it and just being candid and honest and having difficult but needed conversations so that way we can actually find a way to move forward. So with that, again, thank you so much, Diane. We are so excited to have you here as our first guest, to have such an amazing conversation about this. And we hope to hear more from you and more about you all over Maine and national news about how you are furthering ranked choice voting.
Well, I'm excited that you guys are working on this and hosting a roundtable and the podcast so that you can get other people invited. And I hope people learn, also take away not just the ranked choice voting, but that anybody can change the world. Anybody. Like, yes, you can change the world. You just have to have that 20 seconds of courage to stand up and defy the odds. And it is amazing what happens when you just set an intention and you challenge the world and say, I'm going to do this. And they're going to laugh at you. Don't laugh at you. Let them laugh at you, but don't you laugh at you. You keep going, stay focused, and you can do amazing things that you didn't even think were possible.
Beautiful.
You put it beautifully.
Thank you so much.
I've lived it.
No, you clearly
I am
have.
not
Oh my goodness,
special.
your work has been
I am boring and dull. I am not special. Anybody can do this, like, seriously. So
And it's amazing that you're teaching people exactly how to do this.
Yeah, before we finish off, in our last episode, we announced a little giveaway for Rank the Vote tote bag, as I clearly mentioned, was very necessary for college age people, but it's useful for anyone that's carrying stuff around. But yeah, to get into this giveaway, you have to interact with us on our various platforms, like on Facebook, Instagram. You can leave a comment and say what you're really passionate about regarding the ranked choice voting movement. You can also do that by leaving your name and what you're most excited about on our YouTube video and Spotify and anywhere else you can find our podcasts.
Exactly. All right. So that is all that we have for you guys today. Thank you all for tuning in again, listening to the RCV Roundtable. We will have you here in 2 weeks on Wednesday, where we will discuss the ranked choice voting movement in Alaska.
And we look to have a special guest. But thank you guys. Embrace your voice, unlock the choice. Bye,
Mwah.
y'all.
Bye.